I was in the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming. It was a place I had trekked through many times, and the particular loop I was on was the most familiar part of the area for me. I was well equipped, very experienced, and, as always, I carried a Ruger .357 Magnum. Grizzlies had not yet returned that far down into the winds in great numbers, so the pistol was mostly as insurance against mountain lions, black bears, or any two-legged varmints that I might encounter. This story involves the latter. At this point, I want to mention a couple of things salient to this story. First, one thing I learned on solo treks is that after a day or so in, one gets this hyper-awareness that borders on ESP when one is alone in the wilderness. On these kinds of trips, I'd be moving along and my attention would be drawn in one direction. 30 or 45 minutes later, another group of hikers or horsepackers would appear. My awareness of their presence would occur long before I could have possibly seen or heard them. I also saw far more animals on solo trips than when I was with others. Partly because it was quieter being alone, but I believe it was also because of this heightened sense of awareness that came with the profound solitude. I've read about this same phenomenon in books about trappers who went out west alone and in books written by Native Americans. The other point is that if one spends much time up in the Rocky Mountains in the national forests, one runs into the wilderness version of street people from time to time. Every so often on backpacking trips, the group I was in would encounter folks, men, who had clearly been up there for a great deal of time. Their clothing and gear would be dirty, tattered, and worn. They themselves would be grimy and blackened from constant exposure to sun and campfire smoke thick with evergreen pitch interlaid with dust from the trails. They almost always carried guns and said very little. They often were unsettling because they would eye my group's relatively new gear avidly. Once in particular, a group of 3 were latently hostile, although nothing came of it. So, back to the story at hand. It was noon on day 3 of a 7-day loop when I became aware that I was being followed. My solo loops generally stayed on trails, and this one had thus far. That afternoon, I kept stopping and watching my back trail, expecting a string of faster-moving horsepackers to overtake me. I'd met several going out, but, surprisingly, none overtaking me heading in. As it drew into late afternoon, I moved off trail and climbed up onto a rocky ridge where I took cover and watched. Part of me felt foolish and paranoid. Just as I started to chide myself for being paranoid, he appeared. Ragged, thin, and sun-blackened, this scarecrow of a man came slipping down the trail, stopping every so often to look ahead through a pair of battered binoculars. I was looking at him through a pair of binoculars so I could see him in detail. As mentioned, he was gaunt, disheveled, and smoke-grimed. It was impossible to guess his age. He wore a felt-brimmed hat much like mine, but in far worse shape. His gear and clothing were tattered. He had what appeared to be a worn Ruger 10-22.22 semi-auto rifle strapped on his backpack. I don't know if he saw sunlight off of my binoculars or if he had the same aforementioned heightened senses, but he looked at or near where I lay hidden. Then he was out of sight, as the trail cut into a bit of heavy brush. He didn't reappear, but I knew he was there somewhere, watching. I still wasn't completely convinced he was following me, but I quietly ghosted through the rocks and brush until I was over the ridge and in shadows. I had about 3 hours until total darkness. I knew where I was from having trekked in this area a half-dozen times before over the years, and I decided to go off trail, bushwhacking as it's called. Instead of going down the ridge and following the trail, I cut straight across it and snuck cross-country out about 3 miles. I was always quiet on wilderness trips, but now I was sneaking around like I was hunting for deer or elk. I still felt a little foolish, but I was trusting my gut. I eventually swung parallel to the trail, but was several miles wide of it. My hope was to eventually rejoin the trails, making the loop in the next day or so with this guy ahead of me instead of behind. I climbed a second rocky ridge, keeping to cover until I found a shoulder screen from sight in rocks and trees. I never made campfires on my trips, preferring to use a backpacking stove. I was invisible. After dinner, I stood in the darkness and looked out over the way I came. Off in the distance, maybe a mile or so down the valley, I could make out the faint light of a tiny campfire. Surely that's not him. He couldn't have known I went off trail, I thought to myself. I checked the loads in my pistol before I rolled into my sleeping bag/bivy sack. My plan was to start out the next day as soon as there was enough pre-dawn light to safely travel. I wanted to put more distance between me and this guy. Him being in front of me was out of the question. I knew somehow that whatever the reason, I was now roughly 24 miles on foot from my car and I was being followed. I woke up at 0400 in pitch blackness. Dawn was at least 2.5 hours away, this being late August. Glassing his direction, I saw nothing but the dark shapes of the mountains around me. His campfire was burned out. As soon as there was enough pre-dawn gray to navigate, I set off. I was traveling in a wider version of my planned trail loop. This threatened to add another day to the trip, but I had enough extra food, and I had given myself a 2-day cushion of vacation time. I hadn't actually seen him during the couple of times I'd looked back that morning, but I'd seen the glint of reflected light as if off of his binoculars while he looked after me. Although I wasn't as relaxed as I was on previous trips, I felt a perverse thrill. I liked the idea of trying to throw someone off of my trail like an 1840s mountain man trying to elude a Shoshone war party. In my mind, he'd lose interest and go his own way when he couldn't find me. I hiked hard but quiet. My internal frame pack and wind jacket were dark green and my wool pants were a slate gray, so I blended into the rugged Wind River backcountry well. I concentrated on covering as much ground as possible while using the terrain to hide my progress. I stuck to rocky dry ground to keep from leaving boot prints. I ate on the move. Lunch was homemade jerky and canteen water. I could still sense this fucker's presence back behind me. How far? I didn't know. Near dusk, I hiked up and made a hidden camp in a crevice in a huge boulder field that covered the shoulder of one of the peaks. I was at about 11,000 feet with the Continental Divide scarcely 2 miles above me to the east. I had one more day of hiking south/southwest before turning due west for 2 days. Then I'd be back at the trailhead and civilization. As I did the previous night, I scanned back the way I came through my binoculars. A stab of pure fear bit into my gut. Less than 3/4 of a mile downslope, I could easily see the flicker of a small campfire. Even worse, I saw the intermittent glow of what was obviously a cigarette or cigar being smoked not 200 yards down below me. This was no longer any fun. It was this same motherfucker, and there was no doubt he was tracking me. I was being stalked in a game of cat and mouse deep in the largest chunk of wilderness in the lower 48 states. I packed up everything but my sleeping bag, my ground pad, and my pistol. I decided what needed to be done, set my watch alarm for 0200 and slept fitfully. My watch beeped almost inaudibly at 0200 and I was awake instantly. The full moon was just overhead and visibility was good. Up near the divide in the Alpine Valley I was in, it was mostly rocks with only the occasional scrubby evergreen. Holding my pistol in one hand, I began to carefully move down the boulder field toward where I figured his camp to be. The campfire was burned down, but I had noted its position in regard to the adjacent mountain the evening before. After 45 minutes of steady progress, I didn't need the landmarks. I could hear his low rhythmic snores, and I smelled the remains of his fire as I crept up on his camp. 20 minutes later, I was perched on a rocky outcropping 10 feet above his sleeping form. He, like me, was sleeping out under the stars. I had enough moonlight to barely recognize him. I sat and considered my next move. I rejected the idea of waking him up at gunpoint. I couldn't see his rifle, meaning it was probably laying right next to him. Scaring him awake and into a nighttime gunfight seemed a little too extreme. After all, it wasn't illegal for him to follow me. This was public land, and he had not done anything overtly threatening. I needed to let him know that I knew he was following me and that it was starting to creep me out and piss me off. Then I had it. I crept 9 yards away, keeping the outcropping between us. I pulled out the small spiral notebook and pencil I carried from my fanny pack. Pen light in my mouth, I wrote, "I spotted you the day before yesterday. I know you were following me, but I don't know why. It's starting to piss me off. Stop tomorrow or this might get ugly. I could have got you tonight. Move elsewhere. Leave me alone." I quietly opened the cylinder on my pistol and carefully removed one shell. Creeping quietly back, I left the note and the shell in front of his camp, weighed down by 3 small rocks with 3/4 of the note sticking out. It was 0430 by the time I made it back to camp. He never stopped snoring as I left. I started out by flashlight almost immediately, although that proved to be foolishly perilous. With the moon nearly down, the flashlight was inadequate. I made scarcely 1/4 of a mile off the shoulder of the mountain before deciding to wait until pre-dawn to start again. I dozed fitfully as dark clouds loomed in the north and a cold wind came up from the same direction. Late August near timberline in the Wyoming high country can easily go from late summer to winter and back again in the span of a day or two. I pulled out my wool-over shirt and put it on under my windbreaker. An hour before sunrise, I saw his campfire flare up. I walked carefully about 200 yards that way. I cupped my hands and yelled, "I'm making hot oatmeal with honey in a minute. I'll make a bowl out of aluminum foil and leave you some if you want it." After a pause, I barely heard him reply, "I just ate." I yelled back, "Then I'm leaving. I left a note outside your camp between us. You ought to read it." I boiled water, and oatmeal, and coffee. Then after packing my gear, I set out again. Instead of looping gradually back toward the trail, I cut sharply west. This trip was over. I wasn't having fun anymore. In a repeat of the previous day, I hiked hard. This time, however, I stopped and ate a hot lunch. It was cold, windy, and snow flurries fell off and on. By nightfall, I couldn't sense him back there. That night, I couldn't see a campfire behind me. He needed one wherever he was because it snowed intermittently all night. By dawn, my bivy sack and the ground were covered with a dusting of dry snow. That blustery day and the next, other than a couple of backpacking parties heading in on foot or by horseback, I was alone. I hit the trailhead and my car by early evening on day 6. I got on the road straight away and drove 150 miles east before stopping at Guernsey State Park in eastern Wyoming. I slept 4 or 5 hours in the car and then started out again. In the early morning a day later, I rolled back into Dallas. The experience became a dim memory that only pops into my mind every now and then. Usually it comes up as a scary campfire tale. To this day, I can't begin to fathom why that guy followed me. Was he looking to finally get somewhere where he could ambush me so he could take my gear and my money? That's possible. He steadily moved closer during the time he followed me. He wasn't very careful about hiding his campfires, though. Could be he took me for a greenhorn who wouldn't notice him back behind me. It's also possible that he could have been tired of being up there alone for so long, but lacked enough social skills to approach me all the way. Regardless, being tracked by someone through some of the most remote wilderness in the U.S. outside of Alaska was frightening, to say the least. Since then, I've never gone on a solo trip again. I still go very well armed. It's sad, because other than that last trip, I really enjoyed the experience of trekking alone in the wilderness.